A kid without parents thinks he can sit in the same class with us. Laughter echoed through the glass-covered hallway of Lancaster Private High School. Tailored suits, glossy leather shoes tapping evenly on the floor, interspersed with the ticking of Rolex watches, in a place hailed as the forge of America's elite. A dark-skinned teenager, like Edward Wilson, was like an ink stain on a white tuxedo. On the first day he walked through the school gates, no one needed to ask his name. His skin said it all. Just look at him. That face isn't meant for the Ivy League. That line didn't come from a classmate. It came from a parent while walking their child past Edward, then stepping into a Bentley parked in front of the school. That mother glanced at Edward like he was a cockroach that had wandered into a weekend cocktail party. At 16, Edward didn't need anyone to tell him he didn't belong. He felt it in every sideways glance, every skeptical stare, every tight-lipped smile as he walked down the hallway. He was the only black student in the entire school, and the only student without anyone attending Parent Day. While classmates were gifted BMWs on their 17th birthdays, he was counting coins by waiting tables at a cheap Mexican restaurant on weekends, when the whole class buzzed about winter break in Aspen or summer in Europe. Edward quietly worried about textbook fees for the next semester. In the eyes of his classmates, Edward wasn't the poor kid who worked hard. He was the odd one out, a display piece for the diversity quota, nothing more. Filthy rumors spread faster than viruses. Rumor is his mom was a hooker. No clue who the dad is. Maybe he was left in a toilet and someone picked him up. Probably the kid of some maid. Dumped straight into an orphanage. He heard it everywhere. The hallway, the cafeteria, the bathroom, the parking lot. During recess, seats were always accidentally taken when Edward walked over. At lunch, when he sat down. Others stood up, just like that. On the first day of biochemistry, Edward raised his hand after Professor Thornhill's first question. A man with salt and pepper hair, a sharp suit, and a sneer that couldn't hide his disdain. "What's your name?" he asked, eyes lingering on Edward's skin longer than necessary. "Edward Wilson." "You? Sure you're in the right class?" "Yes, I got a perfect score on the entrance exam." Edward held his gaze, though a sharp sting grew inside. "Oh, how unexpected." The professor sneered. No praise, no nod, just a quiet, sarcastic surprise. From that day on, whenever Edward raised his hand, Professor Thornhill would glance and pick someone else. When Edward submitted an essay on neuronal regeneration, a topic requiring deep research, he was given a B with a cold comment, "Too ambitious. Doesn't align with your direction." The most painful part was, Edward always topped every exam, but his achievements were never mentioned. Honor roll, his name wasn't there. Portrait of outstanding students outside the principal's office. Not him. Why, the score verification system is incomplete. The principal's response, as cold as the school bulletin board. The Lancaster cafeteria was spacious and luxurious, with elegant mint trays and delicate fruit jelly desserts, yet it was the place where Edward felt the tightest in his throat. He learned to eat quickly, without looking at anyone, without speaking, avoiding eye contact, avoiding collisions, avoiding emotions. But eyes don't lie. One day, just as he placed his tray down, a group of girls burst into laughter. "Do you want chopsticks or a plastic spoon, like in The Shelter?" Edward's eyes blurred, but he didn't cry. Never. The year-end scholarship ceremony. A magnificent stage, golden lights shining down. The principal called Edward Wilson's name, the student with the highest GPA in the entire school. He walked up, straightened his tie, hands trembling, but eyes held high. The principal shook his hand, then immediately turned away. No one clapped. Not a single round of applause. Not a hug. Not a word of praise. And then, from the audience, a voice rang out, "Hey, Edward, did your mom and dad show up to congratulate you?" The students howled with laughter, covered mouths, elbow nudges. Edward stood in the middle of the stage, spotlight on him, feeling stripped bare under 100 mocking eyes. He held the certificate. A piece of paper that could not soothe what was stirring in his chest. Not tears, something else. Heavier. Rage. Not toward them, but toward the system that placed him here and left him behind. Toward himself, forever thinking he'd be accepted. Toward life for stealing every chance to be loved. He stepped down, not waiting for a handshake, not waiting for a photo. That night, he burned his Lancaster school badge in the dorm sink. The flickering flame reflected in eyes no longer filled with tears. Only resolved, if the world had no place for him, he would build a different world. After graduation, while all his classmates were partying, receiving flowers, hugging their parents with proud smiles, Edward quietly left the campus alone, no congratulations, no one to see him off. He caught the earliest train to Maple Grove Cemetery, a place where he had no relatives except for a name forgotten by the world. An unmarked grave, only the inscription, male, unidentified, traffic accident, 1998, no flowers, no photo, no visitors. That was Edward's father, the only person he could call family, though he had never once seen the man's face in his life. Edward stood still. The entire cemetery was wrapped in early morning mist. The wind blowing through the trees sounded like sighs. He didn't cry. His tears had long dried up. But in his hand, he clutched an old photo. The paper had yellowed, the edges creased from being held too long. In the photo was a blonde woman, her faint smile seeming to hide something. In her arms was a tiny, naked, reddish newborn. It was Edward. He had found the photo in the archives of the social center, buried among files no one cared to look at. On the back was a single sentence written in smudged ink, "Forgive me." Edward squeezed the photo tightly, his hand trembling in waves. It felt like he was crushing a piece of memory, a memory that had never fully existed. Forgive, forgive, who the mother, who abandoned him, like a defective item, the society that labeled him as trash just because of his skin color and background or himself, for hating a woman whose name he had never known. That apology wasn't enough, not enough for the nights he curled up in the orphanage, listening to other kids being taken home by relatives, not enough for the cold meals when classmates dumped leftovers onto his tray, not enough for the graduation ceremony where he stood alone, surrounded by empty chairs. The wind blew hard, as if trying to snatch the photo from his hand. But Edward held on tight. This was the only thing he had left, a blurred fragment of the past. I survived, even when no one believed I would. But I lived, and I will go farther than anyone in this world that once turned its back on me. At the international airport, with a full scholarship ticket to MIT in hand, Edward stood before the gateway between past and future. He thought to himself, "Mom, if one day we meet again, I hope you won't recognize me, because I'm no longer the child you abandoned." 12 years later, Edward Wilson was no longer an unfamiliar name. On the cover of Forbes magazine, that calm face with deep eyes and a piercing gaze appeared beside a bold headline, "The Man Redefining the Future of Medicine, CEO and founder of Regenesis Corporation, the pioneering company in living tissue regeneration and AI-powered medical recovery." A young company, barely 5 years old, yet already standing shoulder to shoulder with giants like Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, thanks to the world's first fully automated tissue grafting technology. And behind it all stood a black man, an orphan, once told he didn't belong at the same table as the children of nobility. But Edward never forgot. Every one of his achievements was a scar carved into the face of the past. Every applause he received was a reminder of the silence he once swallowed. His office on the 73rd floor of the Regenesis Tower wasn't extravagant. Neat, dark wood. On the wall hung a photo, his Lancaster graduation class photo. Edward's face had been scribbled over in black ink. He had it framed just like that. "What are you keeping that for?" asked Julian, his chief advisor. "To remind me," Edward replied without a smile, "that there was a time people wished I didn't exist at the Global Medical Summit in Singapore." Regenesis was preparing to unveil LifeLayer Teal Summit, an adaptive artificial tissue system capable of integrating with the human body in real time. A billion-dollar breakthrough. Investors swarmed, governments waited, and during the strategic signing with European partners, Edward was suddenly introduced to a representative from Whitford Group, a leading Wall Street investment firm that held stakes in major hospital chains across North America. A woman entered. Her heels echoed coldly. Hair silver white, tied up in a perfect bun. A charcoal gray power suit, hugging a body that still radiated dominance in her 60s. Her face, expressionless as if carved from marble. "I'm Evelyn Whitford. A pleasure to meet you." Edward shook her hand, never breaking eye contact. Her hand was cold. Not temperature cold, but emotionless, frighteningly so. "Regenesis is making quite a splash in the healthcare world," she said, with a smile just enough to be polite. "And we never miss a big wave," Edward smiled, courteous. But as Evelyn walked away, Julian leaned in. "She looked at you like you were a bad investment." "No, Julian." Edward adjusted his tie. "She looked at me like I was never meant to exist." 3 days later, the $800 million partnership agreement between Regenesis and the NorthMed hospital chain was abruptly canceled. The reason: non-transparent interference from a third party. Shortly after, NorthMed officially signed an investment deal with Whitford Group. Julian slammed the folder on the desk. "What the hell is going on? We're the exclusive provider of LifeLayer. Aren't we? Not anymore." Edward sat in silence. They just granted licensing to another startup. Rumor has it Whitford had quietly invested in them since last year. And then, like a domino effect, a wave of Regenesis partners began pulling out. Industry news cited concerns about the sustainability of Edward Wilson's technology. The market started raising questions. The media turned its spotlight. Old articles resurfaced about his orphaned past, about his suspension at Lancaster. Suddenly, headlines read, "Edward Wilson. A man with no clear background, is he truly fit to lead the future of medicine?" The real question: if he weren't black, would he be under this much scrutiny? In a live interview on CNBC, a journalist asked, "What do you think about the rumors that Whitford Group is deliberately blacklisting Regenesis because you're a person of color?" Edward looked straight into the camera. "I don't think so. I know." The statement went viral worldwide. A bold, confident declaration, but also the first shot in a war he never imagined would come. Evelyn made no public comment, but Whitford-aligned media outlets began their offensive, calling Edward a man weaponizing race for publicity. A CEO with an inflated ego. Boardroom, Whitford Tower. Evelyn watched as stock graphs flickered on a digital wall. "He's starting to fight back," her assistant said. "Regenesis shares are rebounding faster than analysts predicted." "Kill the tree at the root," Evelyn replied, her voice flat. "Start where he was born." The next day, an exclusive exposé was published. Edward Wilson. From orphanage to billionaire, was it all a scripted narrative? The article read, "The origins of Edward Wilson have never been fully verified. Who is he? Who is his biological mother? Why does no one know anything about his past?" Regenesis was in the eye of a storm. Less than a month after the canceled deal, its stock plunged nearly 20%. The media began drilling into Edward's murky past. Old high school articles were unearthed. The suspension over suspected cheating, records of his time in an orphanage, and worst of all, the unclear identity of his birth parents. One headline appeared across major newspapers: "Edward Wilson, the outsider in black." And when a CEO's origins are questioned, it's no longer a curiosity, it's a signal, a cue for the market to turn its back. Julian slammed the documents onto the desk. "They're dismantling you, Ed." Systematically, Edward sat still, eyes fixed on the cash flow map. On the screen, red arrows pointed at Regenesis from all directions: investments frozen, supplier contracts postponed, health insurance companies reevaluating risk. "What do you want me to do?" Julian growled. "Speak out, expose Whitford." "Fight back with the media." Edward shook his head. "The louder we scream, the weaker we look. I won't give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. So what's the plan? Edward turned the screen around. We show the world something Whitford will never have real results. An emergency meeting was called at the Regenesis lab. Under the cold fluorescence, Edward stood before his top engineers. On the projector, LifeLayer 2.0, the latest version. With tissue compatibility, time reduced from 17 days to just 9. I want a public demonstration. Before the press, before hospitals, before governments, if needed. No statements, no excuses. Only tech, only proof. But while Edward prepared to prove with science, another force was setting the trap. Layer by layer, at Whitford Group headquarters, Evelyn Whitford didn't glance at revenue reports. Her gaze was locked on Regenesis's personnel data. Her lips barely moved as she gave the order, the new engineer. Anderson. Yes. Ma'am, he's in the Regenesis system. Good. Feed him the file on the biomembrane layering protocol, but only up to version 1.1. Only 1.1. Why not all of it? Evelyn turned, her eyes flashing cold steel. I don't need to steal everything, just enough to make him think he's been betrayed. On the day of the LifeLayer 2.0 press conference, the entire world of medical technology turned its eyes to Edward. The demo went flawlessly. The regenerated tissues functioned within all projected metrics. The lab erupted in applause. The media praised it. Regenesis stock rebounded 6% overnight. Edward smiled softly, not out of pride, but because, for the first time in weeks, he saw a flicker of light at the end of the tunnel. That evening, in his private apartment, Edward turned on the TV, and his chest tightened. An exclusive breaking report aired on CNBC. Whitford Group unveils BioLayer, a medical breakthrough with 87% structural similarity to Regenesis's LifeLayer. Before he could catch his breath, his lawyer called. There's an allegation that Regenesis copied technology from Whitford. They filed the patent 1 day before yours. But who files a patent before their product has even completed live testing? She's cheating so blatantly. She rewrote time itself. Julian was nearly shouting. No, Edward whispered. She wants me to be angry. She wants me out of control. The next day, at the National Medical Summit, both Regenesis and Whitford were invited to present. Edward entered the grand hall, lights blazing down. Evelyn stood on stage, presenting BioLayer as if it were the culmination of her life's work. She closed with a story. Back when I was a student at Princeton, I had a friend. He had no family, no name, only intelligence. But in the end, the world didn't ask how smart he was. They asked, "Who are your parents?" And because he had no answer, he disappeared. Her gaze paused on Edward, only for half a second, but it was enough. Everyone in the room understood the story was no mere parable. When it was his turn, Edward said just 3 sentences. Every tree has roots, but not all roots grow in rich soil. Some trees grow out of stone, and they outlive the forest. After the summit, a reporter trailed Edward Mr. Wilson. Ms. Evelyn has repeatedly implied that you don't deserve your position because of your unclear background. Do you believe that's true? Edward turned, his voice low and steady, I think. Some people spend their whole lives protecting the past. I've spent mine building the future, but in the shadows. The past still tugged at the sleeve of the future. 3 days later, Regenesis's internal system was hacked. A design blueprint of LifeLayer 1.1 was leaked online along with doctored evidence, suggesting Edward had stolen the technology from Whitford. The FBI launched an investigation. Lawyers were summoned. Investors panicked. Julian said, "We have to sue. We have to speak out. We have to fight back." Edward said nothing. He was staring at an old photograph on his desk. The blonde woman in the photo, that smile, that face, now looked at him like a noose hanging from the ceiling of memory. He brought the photo closer. Around her neck, a necklace with a green gemstone pendant. And in the latest image, on Whitford Group's website, Evelyn Whitford was smiling at the press, wearing the exact same necklace. Edward exhaled, eyes closed, as if trying to swallow something sharp, cold. and impossible. Why does she look so much like her? That night, Edward didn't sleep. He sat alone on the bench of his 73rd floor balcony, looking down at New York City asleep beneath neon light. The wind cut through his thin shirt, but he didn't feel cold. There was only one image left in his mind, that emerald green necklace. He had seen the photo 100 times, a young blonde woman holding a newborn, him, in a hospital room, and on her neck was that necklace, the same one Evelyn Whitford wore in every public appearance. It couldn't be just a coincidence. But if it wasn't a coincidence, then what did it mean? That Evelyn was his biological mother? No. Edward shook his head. That couldn't be. Not her. Early the next morning, Edward summoned Julian and the internal investigation team. I want everything on Evelyn Whitford. Place of birth, college years, past relationships, medical history, anything connected to the year 1989. Julian blinked in shock. What exactly are you looking for? Edward's voice was low and steady, a secret she's been trying to bury for over 30 years. Meanwhile, across Manhattan, Evelyn sat in a private conference room with the Whitford Group Legal Board. An investigation order has been issued, a lawyer reported. The FBI wants to verify whether there was unlawful access and data theft from Regenesis. Evelyn didn't flinch. She calmly sipped her tea. Legs crossed, a faint smile on her lips. Let's see, she said. If that child can survive when the entire system turns its back on him. But what she didn't know was that the child had learned how to survive in the dark, where no one ever reached out to lift him up. 2 days later, Edward's investigation team returned with their first findings. Evelyn studied at Princeton, Julian reported, graduated with honors in finance. But there's a record of a year-long leave of absence marked as personal in 1989. Edward shot to his feet. That's the same year I was born, at Fairgrove Medical Center. The orphanage took me in 48 hours after. Julian hesitated. There's more. The name of your biological father listed on the original file is Jeremiah M., no last name, and he also went to Princeton. Edward couldn't sit still anymore. He drove 3 hours straight to Fairgrove, the medical center where he was born. The old hospital had been converted into a rehabilitation center, but the records library was still archived in the basement. An elderly nurse named Louise recognized him. I remember you from when you were born. A tiny baby is very quiet. Your mother, she hesitated. She was a strange one. Didn't cry, didn't sign anything, just placed you down and walked away. Edward held up the photograph. Do you recognize this woman? Nurse Louise took the photo, squinting. Looks like her. But her hair was longer back then, and she wore this very distinct green necklace. Edward took a deep breath, his lips pressed into a hard line, his whole body tightened, like it might explode. But the most painful part wasn't confirming she had given birth to him. It was knowing that she had chosen to abandon him. When Edward returned to New York, he found an anonymous email waiting in his inbox. The subject line was just 4 words, not an accident. Inside was an audio recording. The quality was grainy, but the voices were unmistakable. It was Evelyn speaking to someone. I know he's my son. Are you sure? Positive. He's a mirror of him. But he can't know. He must never know. Edward's hands clenched until his knuckles turned white. His chest ached not from anger, but from something deeper, a hollow pain he had never named before. That night, in his office, Edward called Julian in. I need to arrange a meeting with her. Julian stared. Are you sure, after everything she's done? Edward looked down, his voice steady. I need to hear it. From her own mouth. The Plaza Hotel, Manhattan. Private conference room, 39th floor. No press, no assistants, no witnesses. Just 2 people, seated across from one another. A long table draped in white linen. Crystal chandelier overhead casting soft reflections onto the silver-streaked hair of Evelyn Whitford, the woman who had made Titans on Wall Street kneel. And at the other end, Edward Wilson, Black C.O. Once an orphaned child, now sitting upright, his eyes dark and bottomless, staring into the past he had spent a lifetime chasing. Thank you for coming, Edward spoke first, his voice low and courteous, almost suspiciously calm. Evelyn gave a faint smile. You say that as if I had a choice. You always have a choice, just like you chose to dig up the past. Instead of building a future, Evelyn replied, placing her leather clutch on the table, her tone flat, as if speaking to an annoying business associate. But both of them knew this was not a negotiation. This was an execution by words. Edward placed an old photograph on the table. A young blonde woman holding a newborn, him, the emerald necklace glinting at her neck. He said nothing, just slid the photo toward Evelyn. She looked, no surprise, no recoil. She simply lifted a glass of water, took a sip, and said, "If this is how you think you'll get motherly love, I suggest hiring a better screenwriter." "I don't need motherly love," Edward replied. "I just need the truth." The truth, Evelyn smirked, her eyes razor sharp. "The truth is, you were an accident. I was a foolish young student. He was a charming black man, and you were the unwanted result." Edward clenched his fists beneath the table, but his face remained stone. "You knew who I was, all these years." "I did." Evelyn nodded, and I chose silence. Why? Evelyn leaned forward slightly. Because I didn't need a child ruining my name. Because I didn't want to be on the front page under the headline, "Wall Street Queen has black illegitimate son." Because I wasn't about to throw away a lifetime just to prove I had a moment of weakness. Those weren't confessions. They were knives. And Evelyn wasn't stabbing to apologize. She was stabbing to finish him off. "So you chose to destroy me in business," Edward said, his voice now steeled. "Blocked my project, stole my deals, attacked my background, dug into my past." Evelyn paused for 3 seconds, then shrugged. "I chose the simplest way to erase a stain, make it disappear." "You just called me a stain, aren't you?" Evelyn replied coldly. "You may be a genius, a CEO, the face of your generation, but to me, you've always been a mistake. An ink blot on a flawless resume." The room froze. Edward slowly rose, his hand pressed against the table, knuckles pale. "Do you know how far I've gone to find my mother?" "I don't care," Evelyn said, still seated. "I once hoped, even for a second, you'd think I was worth not abandoning." Evelyn laughed softly. "You're mistaken. I didn't abandon you because you were weak. I left because I knew you were strong enough to survive without me." Edward pulled his chair back and sat down again. He growled, "You know, I've never hated anyone in my life, but now I understand I don't hate you for leaving me. I hate you because you knew who I was, and still chose to bury me." Evelyn stared straight into his eyes, "And I don't regret it. It wasn't a defense, it was a sentence, calm, final." Evelyn stood, picked up her clutch, prepared to leave, but just as her hand touched the doorknob, she paused. "What do you want from me?" Edward didn't turn around. "I want you to feel just a fraction of the pain I swallowed every single day." Evelyn was quiet for a beat, then turned back, her voice as cold and sharp as a saw against stone. "Feelings didn't get me to the top of Wall Street. Feelings didn't save me when my parents nearly disowned me for getting pregnant by a black man. And feelings won't help you beat me." Edward rose, eyes narrowing as if seeing right through her. "You're wrong. I don't need feelings to beat you. I just need justice. And it's getting very close." Evelyn gave a dry smile, nodded once, and walked out the door. That night, Edward sat alone in his office. The soft amber glow of the desk lamp lit up the old photo of mother and child. He picked up a pen and gently underlined the faded words on the back, "Forgive me." And just beneath, in sharp, steady ink, he wrote, "I won't, but I'll survive." At the Whitford Group headquarters, in the shadows of her office, Evelyn stood alone before a mirror. She unfastened the emerald necklace, held it in her palm for a long moment, then placed it into a drawer and locked it. No words, no expression, but for the first time ever, she didn't wear it. Revenge if it were just a slap, a lawsuit, or a headline expose would be too easy, too light. Edward Wilson didn't need Evelyn Whitford to fall by scandal. He wanted her to remove every crown she had painstakingly built, peel off every mask she had worn her entire life just to hide a black sun she had denied, not blood, but a spiritual unraveling, slow, silent, and irreversible. Regenesis began to strike back, but without declaring war, without warning, without a word. Edward didn't target the Whitford group directly. He went around contacting every intermediary partner, every small branch, every affiliated hospital, every satellite medical company that Whitford controlled through cross investments. He offered prices 28% lower for the same services. But the real difference lay in the terms Regenesis pledges never to transfer control of its technology to any financial power, meaning partners had full control, with no fear of being sold out or suddenly losing funding as Whitford had done before. Evelyn believed that trust is no match for pedigree. Now, Edward proved pedigree is no match for solid economic policy. Within 45 days, 11 Tier 2 partners withdrew from Whitford's system. A series of hospitals terminated their BioLayer contracts and switched to LifeLayer, or the new platform SoulSkin, a product personally supervised by Edward over the course of 3 years. SoulSkin can regenerate tissue based on individual genetic structure, something BioLayer had never achieved. Edward didn't need to argue. He invited those who had once been crushed by Whitford doctors, researchers, startups that had been swallowed whole, to join Regenesis. No CV required. Just one email. You were once rejected. I won't. For the first time in biotech history, a company openly recruited those who had failed and placed them on the front lines of research. A clear message. I am the place for the unrecognized. Evelyn built an empire by rejecting others. Edward built an empire by welcoming the rejected. Next 2 months, the Whitford Group was placed under special audit. An anonymous complaint was filed with the Food and Drug Administration, an allegation that BioLayer had been developed using intellectual property that had never been officially registered. Evelyn knew it was true, because she was the one who had ordered the extraction of data from the Regenesis system last year. But she believed no one would dare expose her, because everyone feared her. She simply forgot who Edward was. That evening, Evelyn received an envelope delivered directly to her penthouse. No sender, just a single A4 sheet of paper. With one line, I once searched for you like a family. Now I let the law search for you in my place. The hearing was held 2 weeks later. Regenesis presented the entire internal server data, time-stamped prototypes, digital signatures, code revision history, international copyrights. Evelyn sat in the courtroom. Not a single lawyer looked her in the eye. The media exploded. Whitford sued for stealing technology from her own biological son, though Regenesis declined to comment. The truth about the blood relation leaked from a clip of Evelyn speaking with an internal advisor. I know he's my son, but I don't need a mixed blood child ruining my future. Evelyn sat in a dark room, replaying that clip on her phone for the 15th time. Her own voice, cold, clean, precise, like a scalpel. But this time, the scalpel cut her own hand. Revenge didn't come from the outside. It came from the very words she once said, echoing back in a room she could no longer leave. Whitford's stock lost nearly 35% of its value after the hearing. 3 board members resigned. A major shareholder publicly withdrew from the company. Business magazines called it the collapse of the last cold-blooded corporate culture of the 20th century. Meanwhile, Regenesis secured strategic partnerships with 3 European governments. SoulSkin was deployed for soldiers recovering from battlefield trauma. A special medical team called Project Hope was launched, providing free tissue regeneration for war victims and late-stage cancer patients. One morning, as Edward was stepping out of the Project Hope Center, a little boy ran up and hugged his leg. "You're the one who made the thing that saved my mom." Right, Edward knelt down, gently stroked the boy's hair. "Many people made it. I just chose not to give up." That moment was captured on camera, broadcast nationwide, and it reached Evelyn's eyes. Evelyn didn't cry. She sat in an empty office, staring at the photo she had once hidden deep in a drawer, a picture of her holding baby Edward in the hospital. She lit it on fire. But the flame didn't reach the edge. Her hands trembled, and then, for the first time in over 30 years, she muttered aloud, "Was I wrong?" No one answered. Only the TV screen behind her, still playing the scene of Edward smiling. The Whitford Group's board of directors officially called an emergency meeting on Monday morning. Evelyn arrived 7 minutes late, something that had never happened in her 3 decades as chairwoman. In the luxurious, glass-walled room, once the stage of historic takeovers, no one stood to greet her. The eyes that once bowed before the power of the Wall Street she-wolf now held only coldness, and perhaps bitterness. "We'll begin." One board member spoke, not waiting for her to sit. "Begin," what Evelyn lifted her chin, but the steel in her voice cracked slightly. "A vote to dismiss the chairwoman," came the curt reply, "on grounds of severe governance misconduct, intellectual property fraud, and significant damage to the company's reputation." Evelyn laughed. "Have you forgotten who put the Whitford name on the global financial map?" Another member, older, once her most loyal ally, looked at her with weary eyes. "And you're the one who made that name a laughingstock." The very ones who once knelt at her throne were now the ones shattering it to pieces. The vote commenced. 9 votes in favor, 2 abstentions, 1 against her own. That very afternoon, headlines exploded. "Evelyn Whitford dismissed. The reign of Wall Street's most powerful woman has ended." She left headquarters without a word. No reporters, no tributes, no farewell. Only a sealed envelope was left on her desk, unsigned, with a single line, "In the end. The one who abandoned is abandoned." Evelyn returned to the penthouse, the sprawling apartment, once the venue for parties, political receptions, and investor gatherings, now echoed only with the sound of her own footsteps. She poured herself a glass of red wine, sat by the window, and looked out at the Regenesis building glowing on the other side of the city, in the silence of night. She opened the safe beneath her desk. Inside were her most precious possessions, the original biolayer blueprint, an unsent letter written to her newborn son, and a photograph. Edward, as a child, smiling. She tore the photo in half, but her hands trembled. For the first time in years, Evelyn cried. The dream of power had consumed everything she had, and now it gave her back only a vacant chair, an unacknowledged memory, and a son who no longer needed her. At that very moment, inside Regenesis, Edward stepped into an international press conference, not to celebrate, but to announce the launch of GN Restart, a global initiative to regenerate tissue for war victims and children harmed by medical violence. A reporter asked Mr. Wilson, "Do you have any message for Mrs. Evelyn?" Edward looked into the camera. His eyes no longer carried anger, no resentment, only the quiet of someone who had lived long enough to understand forgiveness doesn't need a reply. "I have nothing to send," he said. "What I wanted to say, I've already said. The rest, she'll have to live with her own choices." That night, a special courier arrived at Evelyn's apartment, handed her a thin envelope. No return address. Inside was a printed article. The first print edition of Time magazine, with Edward on the cover. Bold letters across the front, the heir of nothing and builder of everything. 3 months after Evelyn Whitford was dethroned from the seat of financial power, her name had all but vanished from headlines. No more phone calls from the White House. No more magazine covers. No more whispered reverence from investors. The world seemed to have forgotten her, but couldn't stop talking about someone else. Edward Wilson, the once nameless orphan boy, the one Evelyn herself had once humiliated, was now a global symbol, not just as a billionaire CEO, but as the man who gave humanity something deeper faith in rebirth. Regenesis is not just technology, Edward once said in a speech at the United Nations. It's a promise to those who are left behind that we are not defined by pain, but by how we live beyond it. And strangely enough, the very child abandoned by his own mother was now the one healing thousands of other mothers, mothers who once believed their children were lost forever to illness and war. At the Geneva Global Health Summit, Edward took the stage to thunderous applause, but unlike the usual spotlight-hungry speakers, he didn't flash numbers, charts, or financial models. Instead, he walked on stage with a 10-year-old Palestinian boy, paralyzed completely after a landmine explosion. Solskin, TM, Regenesis's proprietary regenerative tissue technology, had fully restored the boy's damaged spinal cord. The room fell silent as the child took slow, trembling steps, and reached for Edward's hand. "I used to think I was born to slowly die," Edward said, eyes on the boy. "But now, I live so that children like him can keep walking." After the talk, Edward didn't rush off stage. He walked the aisles, shaking hands with every doctor, nurse, volunteer, and journalist. Each handshake reminded him of the hands that had once turned away. At the far end of the hall, an elderly woman stood. Her face was hidden behind a thin mask. Her eyes were sunken and tired. No one recognized her. But Edward stopped. His gaze met hers, as if he had once seen those eyes long ago. I'm sorry." Her voice broke. Edward said nothing for a moment. No acknowledgement, no rejection. "No. Who are you?" Just a quiet reply. "I don't need an apology. I just need you to live the rest of your life the right way." The woman lowered her head. Her trembling hand slipped back into the crowd. It could have been Evelyn, or not. But one thing was certain: Edward no longer needed her recognition. He no longer needed anyone to validate who he was. He defined himself by how he chose to live. At the same time, in a small coastal town in the south of France, a modest wooden house stood between two stretches of white sand and a row of old pine trees. The house had no internet, no television. No one knew who the owner was. Every morning, Mrs. Evelyn made tea. Every afternoon, she read the newspaper. On the table was an old laminated photo: Edward at 3 years old, grinning widely, wearing a blue wool outfit, a photo that had never been made public, seen only by a mother. From the shelf, she took down the only item that still shined: a metal plaque engraved with the words, "Solskin Team, saved the 10,000th life." Every time she read it, her chest ached, not from regret, but because time could not be turned back. That night, a letter was delivered to the wooden house. No sender's name, just one handwritten line: "I don't hate you, but I no longer live for you." Evelyn read it again and again. She folded the letter, did not burn it, did not tear it, just placed it in the drawer next to the old photo. She once thought power was the only thing keeping her alive, but it turned out the one she abandoned was the only one who still remembered her. In New York, Edward did not stop. He founded the Forgotten Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping orphaned children in conflict zones, providing tissue regeneration equipment to hospitals in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia. At each inauguration ceremony, Edward appeared for only 5 minutes. No speech, no flowers, no autographs. He simply stood beside the children and quietly watched them run, jump, and laugh with the very legs once sentenced to never heal again. One day, Julian, his close assistant, asked him, "Why don't you accept any recognition you've saved over 10,000 lives?" Edward smiled. "Because I don't want the orphaned child I once was to think he still needs anyone's approval." Those rejected by the world always grow up with 2 choices to become the next source of pain, or the last one to bear it. Edward chose the second. A year later, Edward was selected as the keynote speaker of the World Economic Forum in Davos. On the white snow, among powerful suits, he began with a simple sentence: "The day I was expelled from school because of my skin color. I made a vow I would never let a child look up to someone else just to find the reason for their existence." The applause erupted. He ended his speech with a single sentence: "Don't ask who I am. Look at what I chose to do when no one stood by me." At that very moment, in the small house in France, an old woman looked out at the sea. Her hand rested on her chest, where an emerald necklace once hung. She whispered, "Edward," but the wind was too strong, the waves crashing against the shore. No one heard it, and perhaps he no longer needed to.